Hello, everybody. This is Kenton Taylor Howard. I'm a PhD candidate in the Text and Technology program at the University of Central Florida. I'm also an instructor in the Games and Interactive Media program at UCF, and I'll be joined today on this roundtable by several other colleagues. And I'll be joined today on this roundtable by several other colleagues. Our talk today will be called If.then, Teaching Programming Concepts Using Interactive Fiction. And to give you a brief overview of how the session will flow, each of us will obviously be talking about work that connects programming and interactive fiction. Most of us will also focus on Ink, which is an interactive fiction scripting engine, but we'll also talk about how those ideas could work for other kinds of IF engines as well to varying degrees throughout our talks. We will talk about each of our individual pieces of work first before having a short roundtable discussion among the panel at the end of the session where we discuss questions and connections and things like that between all of our work. And we did envision this originally as being more of a roundtable format and including a bit more audience interaction, but obviously that's more difficult to do due to the given circumstances. So we'll be answering questions on Discord and Twitch live throughout the session, and you can find us there if you have any questions and just type them into the chat. To give you an introduction to what Ink is and make sure everybody understands what Ink does and kind of how it works, it's a choice-based interactive fiction scripting language, and I usually compare the output of Ink to Twine, so it looks very similar to Twine if you are familiar with that. It was created by Inkle, which is a game design company from Cambridge, England. And Inky is the engine that's used to create Ink stories using Ink code. So just to kind of clarify some of the different terms that you see and may hear us using throughout this roundtable, those are the kind of distinctions that I'm trying to get at with this overview. And it's a free open source engine that supports Windows, Mac, and Linux. So it's pretty accessible and pretty available if it's something that you're interested in getting involved with. It also has a plugin that allows you to convert an Ink story into Unity, which is a popular game design engine. Unity allows you to do things like create 3D environments and visuals and audio and things like that. So the idea is that you can use Ink code and the Inky engine to create a narrative for your game and then use Unity to create the visuals and the sound effects and stuff like that. And the company has used that approach pretty successfully to create popular games like Heaven's Vault, which I remember chatting with a few people at NarraScope last year about. 80 Days was another game that they created that got a reasonable amount of press and was pretty critically well received. So to introduce what I'm going to talk about in my portion of this talk, I'm going to essentially cover three things. I'm going to give an outline of my PhD dissertation, which is titled A Design Framework for Learning About Representation in Video Games Through Modification of Narrative and Gameplay. I'm also going to give some code and story examples from the game prototype that I made as part of this project, which is titled Life in the MEGAPOCALYPSE. And then I'm going to give some sample assignments based on the approach that I outline in my PhD dissertation toward the end of the talk. My PhD dissertation itself consists of two components, so it's kind of two linked projects. There's a written framework for using video game modification to teach people about queer representation in video games, and that's the written portion of the dissertation focuses pretty heavily on pedagogical, theoretical elements surrounding that kind of idea. And the game is an easily modifiable video game prototype that I designed to allow people to explore queer representation in video games by modifying it. The written component consists of 5 chapters, and it outlines the goals for my approach. It also contains a design document for the game, which is a little bit non-traditional for a PhD dissertation. And while I don't plan on doing any sort of formal user testing of the prototype as part of the written component, mostly because I discussed that idea with my committee quite a bit, and we landed on the realization that that was probably way too large in scope for what I was proposing, given I'm already doing a written project in a game. There is a decent chance that I'm going to do some of that informally, and a pretty good chance that as post-dissertation work, I'll do some sort of study on the effectiveness of this approach and this prototype. The game is titled Life in the MEGAPOCALYPSE, and it's a choice-based interactive fiction game that I developed in Ink. Eventually, I'll release it on my website because Ink allows you to create web packages that are made up of HTML and CSS and other kinds of web code that you can then upload online and have people play it as a browser-based game. The game focuses on queer characters surviving in a megapocalypse setting. So what I mean by a megapocalypse is a world where essentially multiple different apocalypse tropes have played out at once. So there's zombies and bandits and killer robots and all sorts of other things that the player can encounter. And the player isn't really necessarily a member of the character's party or a leader or something like that in this game. The player is basically guiding the characters on their journey. The game itself consists of chat sections where the player is talking with the characters to learn more about them. and then encounter sections where the player is giving the characters advice when they come up against a horde of zombies or something like that, and giving them, tips on how they can resolve the situation. The game ends typically in one of two ways. Either at least one character makes it to safety. The player is an inhabitant of a safe zone and trying to guide these characters to that safe zone. So if one character or more makes it to the safe zone, then that's one ending for the game. Another potential ending is that all the characters get lost, either abandoning the party or dying or something like that. The game itself is designed for quick play sessions, so typically 5 to 10 minutes tops is what I usually expect that people would spend on a play session. It's also designed to be easily modifiable, so it's designed with lots of code comments so that it's very, very easy for someone who wants to get in and start changing the systems and the narrative of the game to do that. And I'll eventually make it available on my website to that end. Some sample code from the game, I think, helps to highlight the kinds of programming concepts and things that I'm working with in the game itself. So what I've got here on the left is some sample code for setting variables in Ink. Ink treats all variables as untyped, but there are string variables here where I'm setting the character's name and gender pronouns. There are Boolean variables where I'm tracking whether or not you've heard certain components of the character's story. There are integer variables in the game where I'm tracking how often you talk to the characters. And then on the right side, I've got some sample code from the chat system to show you how those variables get changed and how they get used in actual gameplay. So here I'm setting the backstory heard variable to true because now you've heard this character's backstory. I'm increasing the total chats variable by 1 because you've talked to somebody. And then you see a snippet of narrative text where I use the character's name and several of the character's pronouns, and that's to give examples of how these can actually get used in the game. So some assignments I propose in my dissertation based on this that I think people could use to learn different programming concepts. The simple ones ask students to just change simple things like the character's name and gender pronouns, things that are stored in variables. And those I would envision being introductory assignments that you might be able to use in an introductory level programming class. The more complex ones ask students to overhaul a character more significantly, so don't just change their name and gender variables, but modify their backstory, their strengths, their weaknesses, and really kind of give a full narrative overhaul to the character. So that might be a good thing in a class that's trying to teach people about programming and interactive fiction. And the large projects ask students to do something pretty significant, like create an entirely new character with appropriate variables, integrating that character completely into the game's narrative and mechanics and encounter systems and everything. So those usually represent a pretty significant amount of work. The sample assignment I'm going to talk about today is one of the introductory ones because I can envision this being used in lots of different types of classes where an introduction to programming might be useful, and simply because it's shorter and I can cover that more effectively within the scope of this presentation. So this first simple assignment would ask students to go in and basically change a character's name, a character's singular, possessive, and object pronouns, and then create a playable game with a consistent story afterwards. And in all the assignments, I do mention that the player should be accounting for the new narrative content that they've created too. So when you change a character's gender pronouns from male to female, obviously that's going to change the character's actual story. And so I tell people in these assignments that they should be accounting for that as well. So in conclusion, where I expect these things could go and what people could use them to help students learn, I think that this approach could help students learn the concept of tracking gameplay states with variables, which again is something really useful in an introduction to game programming class. The types of classes I teach at UCF often cover that kind of content. I also think it could introduce students to the way that things like representation are encoded into games using variables. So games like Dragon Age with romance systems are often doing stuff like tracking the player's gender and sexuality using variables, and I think it would be a good way to introduce students to that kind of concept too. And I think it could introduce students to how those concepts apply to the design of IF games. And if I was using this in a classroom setting, I would probably also be introducing appropriate IF games alongside of this approach. So for example, stuff like gender swapping or gender queering systems are really common in the choice of games, IF games. And so that might be the types of games that I would be using with the students. And then there's more complex ones where we see situations like a character's sexuality getting constructed by the player's choices. And that kind of thing comes up in games like Blue Lacuna by Aaron Reed. And I don't know if I would necessarily use that entire game in a class only because of how large it is, but I think it would be a really, really good way of introducing students to those kinds of ideas. So I want to thank you all for listening to me today and pass it along to my next presenter. I'll be available in Twitch and Discord if you want to chat with me, and you can also reach me on my website or via email or Twitter or something like that too. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is John Murray. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Central Florida in the Games and Interactive Media program. My research examines the relationship between platforms and the content created on them, with a focus on interactive narrative and reality media. I've co-authored 2 books and have 3 ongoing projects. For more information on any of them, or to sign up and be notified of any calls for participants, visit my website. This talk is organized into 3 sections. First, I will introduce Salt Immortal Sea, an interactive narrative I worked on that was built using Ink and Unity. I will discuss the choices we made and how they generalize to interactive narrative organization. I will conclude with some basic strategies for testing projects using the capabilities of Unity and the Ink plugin. Our goal with Salt Immortal Sea was to interpret and relate the often marginalized experience of a modern refugee with ancient representations and figures. It was published in the New River Journal in 2018 and has been exhibited in various versions at conferences across the world. Mark and I settled on using Ink as the core engine for the text content of the experience because it helped keep a clean separation between changes in the text and revisions to the art and user interface design. Organization and variation can go hand in hand. Careful use of randomness can effectively introduce variation in the content level of an interactive narrative, providing the audience a sense of discovery and an urge to revisit the piece. One of the more extreme examples of this is Aaron Reed's work, Subcutanean, where each playthrough is unique and generated by a seed. When planning an interactive narrative, it may be hard to think of ways to incorporate randomness or variation, as it is a particular way of looking at stories, which are often fixed. The goal is to use your authored content as efficiently and as effectively as possible. If the audience only experiences a particular dialogue exchange in a small percentage of playthroughs, then that use may not be very efficient. If the variation is unnoticed or the content doesn't add to your intended effect, it may not be very effective. This concept was one of the foundational principles pioneered by Telltale Games before they closed, where much of the content of their games was seen by each player. In programming, it is imperative to avoid unnecessary repetition, as it can lead to difficult to maintain code and often is considered a bad practice. Yet repetition and cycles are a valuable technique of storytelling. If the big bad wolf didn't repeat his dialogue for each pig and huff and puff, the effect would surely have been lessened. When you incorporate explicit choices where the player expects the outcome to be different, it's important to remind them that you were listening. This may only require a small section of content to refer back to their choice, possibly by checking a variable or referring to a particular circumstance around their decision. The reference, no matter how small, will give the player a sense of satisfaction that their action was listened to and incorporated into the story, even if the choice didn't quite make it into a major plot event. Variation can also come in the form of alternate phrasing, which is particularly important when you have a scene or location that the player may revisit frequently. It is important to think about what every playthrough contains that makes it a part of your particular piece. It might be that the introduction and conclusion remain consistent, or even the episodic nature. Both of these strategies we will review when we look at the structure of Salt Immortal Sea next. Salt Immortal Sea includes a choice of who the player's point of view character is. In the introduction, the player can choose their identity, and this choice determines whether other characters will open up or not. It also provides an obvious way to explore the variation, as the player can select a different character for another playthrough. Once the player has chosen their identity, a sequence of stages occur in a cycle 3 times. First, there is a chance that a random event might occur, one where the player can respond to it or make a choice. Then the player is offered an option to talk to one of the other passengers in order to solve the mystery of who angered the gods. The character that they choose to interact with will relate one of 8 stories, with the variation to the story determined by both who is telling it as well as who the player chose as their point of view character. Importantly, any character can tell any story, allowing a variety of possible combinations. The player then has a chance to learn a hint that they can use to deduce the identity of the passenger who angered the gods. Once this cycle is completed 3 times, the player is forced to decide who they think it was that angered the gods, and whether they will give them to the gods or fight the gods. Our workflow divided evenly between Unity and Ink. I worked primarily in Unity after we decided on the structure, and Mark worked solely within the Ink source file. An early decision was to make sure the game was completely playable entirely within Ink, rather than to split the logic between Ink and Unity, where the only way to test the game would be to load the project in Unity. This way, Mark would be able to continue editing the story while I worked on any bugs or errors in the user interface. There were several screens that had interfaces that had to be adapted to Ink's choice system as a result of this decision, such as selecting a character to talk to or choosing the point of view character. In these, the choices were represented by graphics in Unity, but in Ink they were simply text. The importance of testing can't be emphasized enough. I'm going to discuss 2 main strategies for making sure your project does what you intend. I won't review the entirety of the Unity interface, as there is some good documentation out there. Instead, I'm going to focus on the Ink plugin, which provides a window called the Ink Player. You can find it in the window menu on recent versions of Unity after you install the plugin. You'll save the Ink file in your Unity project directory and drag the generated JSON file into the window. Besides the main scene view and game view, the console is also a powerful tool to track events that take place in your program. How do we look underneath the hood of a program? We need to evaluate whether our scripts and the code is behaving as we expect. We can do that 2 ways. We can either trace the code by printing out some output statements, or we can look at the code's internals through something called direct inspection. When you print values to the console, or even just messages, these are called traces. Much like the script of previous choices in an Ink game, these allow you to track events that may not show up on the game screen. It's a good idea to add statements that track important things, like entering functions or changing values. Printing too many, though, might distract you from what is actually taking place, so keep them to a minimum. In this example, I printed out the key parameters in a function that reveals the text in order to ensure the logic was correct. Note that I include some information to make it easier to understand in the trace text itself, rather than just printing a bare value. The Ink player in Unity provides the ability to see the inside of a program's memory, allowing you to see the value of each variable. You can also select a variable in the Ink player to highlight or watch it. Breakpoints must be set in an integrated development environment like Visual Studio, and so they might not be suitable for beginners. I've included a page of links in the presentation slides that will be published along with the talk. Consider different structures in games or IF that you play, and how you might describe them in a tool such as Ink. Remember to remind players of the decisions they've made, and avoid unintentional repetition through random variation. Working with Ink can make collaborative projects easier to test and develop, as you can isolate content into segments and distribute your work. You can even take an existing Ink story and add additional features or graphics using Unity. I want to throw a shout out to Inkle Studios for making such an awesome tool, and thank you for listening.
Hi, my name is Dan Cox. As Taylor introduced me, I'm a PhD student in the Text and Technology program and a full-time instructor in the Games and Interactive Media department at the University of Central Florida. In my part of this presentation, I'm going to talk about concept scaffolding, the difficulties of knowing what your students know, and the importance of testing. If you have heard the term scaffolding, you might think it has something to do with buildings or maintenance or other related activities. You might even be picturing a series of different levels of structures around a construction site. If you teach, or you spend any time with teachers, you might have heard the phrase instructional scaffolding. This is the application of what we might think of as scaffolding that placement of a series of increasing levels as a metaphor for teaching students at different points in their own development. This metaphor has its roots in a number of different places, but a common inflection point of the history of term instructional scaffolding is the work of Lev Vygotsky in the use of the term zone of proximal development. This is also sometimes known by its initials ZPD. In this model, a student is mapped within this zone between what they can accomplish without help, where they might need some help, and then finally where, even with help, a student might never be able to accomplish a task. As an instructor planning assignments across the semester or across another longer term, the goal is to create a series of increasingly difficult tasks where a student can accomplish them with some help if they want it, but not too difficult where they can never finish them even with the instructor's help. This creates an interesting problem. How do you know what your students know? Put in a different context, how do you know what your players know? In the context of interactive fiction, the problem is both easier and harder. On the one hand, it is easier to know what a player experiences. Maybe they visit a passage in Twine, or they visit a knot in ink. Values of variables can be adjusted. Certain Boolean flags can be changed, content can be moved around. Simply through navigating through the game and enabling different checkpoints, player can gain knowledge. However, on the other hand, as a developer, how do you know that they know what they know? One way to get closer to understanding is to assess the students or the players. I want to throw two more terms out to help with this as I move into talking about testing and how this relates to its connection between scaffolding and knowledge. When we consider assessment as part of pedagogy, we generally talk about two different forms, formative and summative. We also frequently use the terms low stakes and high stakes associated with those two terms. Major tests are bad pedagogy. A class composed of just tests, just exams, or just papers is incredibly bad design. I want to repeat that. It's bad pedagogy. This is also bad game design. You do not start the player at the ending of the game and expect them to solve a complex puzzle. You also don't start them at the end boss and expect them to win on their first try. You start them on something simple. They open the mailbox. They navigate a house. Then, slowly, you introduce the hidden empire under the house and perhaps its lurking group. This is the same with teaching. Well, minus the GRU, sometimes. Assignments, tasks in the model of the zone of proximal development start small and building complexity over time. At different intervals, you check the student's knowledge in small ways, using what is known as low-stakes tasks or low-stakes assignments. These are formative assessment opportunities. You form the student's knowledge through being an expert and working alongside the student, and you guide them through providing feedback. I want to give you an example of how I do this. I teach JavaScript. When I teach JavaScript using Node.JS, for example, I start students with console.log. It's a very common function used in everyday development for web development and testing. We start with just printing simple strings. We just print simple messages to the console. I then introduce the package Chalk, which allows for using different text colors on the console. We then talk about what we know about JavaScript and now what we've learned about Chalk and then how we can put them together. I then combine this knowledge with the package beep beep, which if you don't know, allows for creating beeping noises on the console. When we combine all three, we have a whole lot of fun. Everybody just loves it. We have text colors, we have beeping noises, and the classroom's full of these things. But at each step along this way, I have an assessment aspect. Students are asked to produce a few lines of code, then asked to provide a few more, and then asked to provide a few more. Each step along the way, I review what they've done, and I give feedback. Great job here, watch out for that along that route, and I help to form their learning and guide them as an expert, relatively, in JavaScript. By a few weeks into the semester, students are comfortable making projects in Node.js, they're potentially writing dozens of lines of code, and they really love sending me things that has lots of crazy colors and beeps at me when they submit it, and I honestly really enjoy their projects. Everyone also has a story. It's always about bad testing. Whenever I meet people outside of an academic context, and I mention that I teach and really enjoy teaching, I will, inevitably, hear about a bad classroom or a test experience. Almost always, this was because of some summative assessment that was poorly planned. If formative assessment is the low stakes, the more fun aspect of helping a student along on their journey, summative assessment is the bigger, tougher sister concept. Summative assessment sums up the previous material and usually takes the forms of quizzes and tests and exams. These are the things students dread. They hate them. In interactive fiction terms, this is the major puzzle, or it's the battle. The player uses their knowledge that they have gained so far. This is the summation of their knowledge. Concept scaffolding and the use of the zone of proximal development uses both approaches, both formative and summative assessment, to keep track of a student's progress and help them master more complicated tasks over time. Assignments are designed, when designed well, to test their knowledge at different points moving along what you can think of as a wave. That is, they go down a wave in formative, come up a wave in summative. So they're going down and coming back up. And this creates a nice momentum when designed well that helps students move from one task to another, to another, to another, to another, to another. Each time testing them with just enough difficulty that they are starting to learn, and then coming back up, and then going back down, and coming back up. In a good classroom, or even a good game design, this momentum really helps students to prepare for the GRU in their lives, moving them not directly to the enemy they fight, but giving them time to build up to that point. As I wrap this up, I want to highlight two public projects where part of what I've been saying have been put into play, so to speak. If you know me at all, you might know me in connection to the Twine Cookbook project. For the past 2 years, I've worked as its editor with the larger community to just collect examples and create a large compendium of code. With this latest move into 2.0, we have also introduced sections on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, very specifically designed in mind to express this idea of scaffold learning. We want to help people gain some experience with this before they move on to the story format documentation, which tends to be a little more technical in nature. The other thing I want to highlight, and what I'm very excited about more recently, is Taylor Howard and I have been working on the unofficial Ink Cookbook project. This teaches the narrative scripting language Ink. It's currently in a 1.0 version, but it's ready for people to read. It's also ready for people to help us make it better. We've given it a Creative Commons license, and we really hope that it finds a home both in and out of the classroom to help people learn Ink through, you might have guessed, scaffolded learning. It even has some short try it sections. These are based on Taylor's experience teaching Ink in the classroom and my background as an instructional designer. Hopefully, I've been as clear as I hoped I was when I wrote and recorded this. But if you have questions or you just really want to reach out, I can be reached on Twitter. I also sometimes post on my YouTube channel, occasionally. I can also be found in the NarraScope Discord for the next few weeks before I take a break for summer. But I really want to thank you for your time. Thanks for watching and stay safe, everybody.
Hi, I'm Rachel Donley. I'm a recent graduate at the University of Central Florida's Digital Media Master's Program, soon to be pursuing a PhD at Georgia Tech in the fall. Today, I'm going to be talking about introducing basic code concepts through variable text in Ink. My experience comes from operating as a teaching assistant, grading hundreds of students' Ink stories in an interactive design course for 3 semesters. I'll start by recapping some relevant points about the course, then reviewing the basic code concepts we've taught students with Ink, and highlighting one particular challenge I encountered with students grasping these concepts, that even correctly written code needs to serve a purpose. The course I assisted with, Fundamentals of Interactive Design, is an introductory course in the Games and Interactive Media department at the University of Central Florida. As such, we needed to teach students who would be pursuing either a web development or a game design track. The first major project they completed was a website, and the second was writing a work of interactive fiction in ink. In this, ink is ideal from a code standpoint. As Taylor mentioned, there is a Unity plugin that uses ink. Inky stories can also be exported to the web, creating an HTML file that can be manipulated and styled with JavaScript and CSS, making it a good follow-up to reinforce web design lessons from earlier in the semester. Conceptually, creating interactive stories in ink has more of a game design lean, but basic consideration of user paths and how user choice can manipulate output is useful in both fields. In light of the massive movement to remote teaching, it is worth noting that in this most recent semester, this was an online course. With almost 150 students, we needed to try to effectively introduce these concepts with limited time and interaction. We found scaffolding assignments, or breaking up the ink project into smaller stages due each week, allowed us the time to provide feedback and make sure everyone was on the right track, with time for them to correct if not. As Taylor mentioned, ink is a programming language, so there is a lot of potential for complexity here. For an introductory course, though, we focused on introducing students to conditionals and variables through ink's variable text options, the conditional text and alternative text. A quick note for those unfamiliar with ink, one fundamental concept to note here is the not. A not is a named section of content and is a key means of organizing the content of the story. In ink, conditional text output is dependent on conditions set by the writer. Specifically, conditional code checks whether or not a not has been visited, and alters content of the story based on that information. An example here shows two nots, room and outside. If the player has visited room, they will find the character Janice is asleep. They won't have this knowledge otherwise. Therefore, using a conditional for the not outside that checks whether or not room has been visited follows the actual knowledge the player has acquired through play and upholds the logic of the story. The conditional gives students the ability to consider how content is connected and how actions influence the story seen by the player, and then put these design considerations into practice. The other form of variable text, alternatives, has a few set types that change content based on how many times a not has been revisited. A sequence shows the next element and repeats the last. A cycle loops content repeatedly, and a once only shows the next element and then nothing at all, once all of those elements have been cycled through. Shuffle shows text by random selection. The first example here is a sequence, and the second is a cycle. Both require the not to be revisited to activate. This is needed for all alternatives with the exception of the shuffle, which will show text by random selection from the very first time it is visited. Alternative text gives students an opportunity to consider and incorporate the passage of time, chance, and repeating actions as factors in their story. The primary challenge I encountered when grading student assignments was a disconnect in understanding what defines working code. The most common mistake was code that is written correctly, as in it does not produce an error, but it serves no purpose. An example here was common: conditional text placed within the not checked for. Because it will always register as true that the not has been visited, there is no way the not can be seen without the code activating. Writing the sentence without any code at all would be the same thing, and therefore the code does not actually work. The most effective means to address this, particularly with an online course, all revolved around the scaffolding format mentioned earlier. The earliest scaffolding assignments involved mapping out their story, giving them time to consider where a conditional or variable text could meaningfully influence what they have written. We divided writing ink code into two later assignments. A basic ink assignment had students put their story into ink without requiring the variable text, and an advanced ink assignment focused exclusively on adding this variable text. This structure let students get comfortable with ink, and then gave them time to work on just the variable text, which was conceptually a bit more of a leap than just writing in ink. Adding variable text in Advanced Ink also allowed me to focus comments on any coding issues here, rather than needing to parse through potential other errors involved in just transferring the story to ink. Of course, examples are always beneficial to help bring points home. This is a short story I wrote as a demonstration of mistakes and correct ways to incorporate variable text. The decision knot contains the alternative text, and a knot after provides opportunity to return to decision and activate the alternative options. If there was no way to return to the knot, the code would be pointless. The conditional within the yeah knot is the same mistake I pointed out earlier, checking the knot it is in. A working conditional is in project, where success is determined by whether or not the player visited the yeah knot. And it is possible to get there by two different paths, so the conditional may or may not activate. Hopefully the story's content also served to underscore the significance of correctly adding a conditional to their projects. Thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions now through Twitch or at any time via email or Twitter.
Hello, everybody. This is the roundtable portion of the panel, and we're all here in Zoom. So we're going to just kind of be discussing different questions and chatting amongst ourselves and things like that. And I guess I will start us off because I had an overall question for everybody on the panel. Obviously, we focused a lot on programming in our talks because naturally that was the topic we were kind of going toward. But one thing I've often found or like talked about with students when I'm teaching interactive fiction is that it does come from this kind of like dual tradition of both games and programming, especially like parser IF, and literature, especially like choice-based IF, where we have things like choose your own adventure books and stuff like that. So I guess one thing I wanted to ask to everybody, I don't know how much experience everybody has with literature and things like that, but that's the background I come from. Do you think there are any literary concepts that might potentially help people with learning this stuff, or that can we draw from that in some way?
I think one overall thing to consider is, even though I think it may be as common that people consider like novels or something more linear to be very different, but there is still a concept when writing any kind of fiction that the story is not solely the author's. Like the reader is the one who is finishing that narrative, and that component is out of the author's control. So I think even though interactive fiction feels like a different medium and is in a lot of ways, that kind of collaboration between the reader and the author still exists there.
I would also say some narrative ordering devices are useful to think about. You don't necessarily have to have events occur one after the other in sequence, like you would encounter in an adventure game. Analepsis and prolepsis, or the trail of events out of order, is really useful if you want to potentially provide backstory, or you may want to just provide variety while a player is just stuck in a room looking at things, especially in terms of getting the emotional effect you want. You may want to vary the tone from happy to sad, and being able to do that in the same time and space is actually pretty difficult.
Yeah, I think temporality is an interesting thing that connects all of these as well. I mean, Dr. Mary was just sort of talking about these rise and flow of story. I think something else we consider, especially when we look at twine that has passages, ink that has knots, this idea of sort of units, and then the fluctuations between these, the movements between points in a story along, like Rachel was just saying, like, as the reader is doing this, constructing a narrative from these parts.
Yeah, I think in particular, one of the things I often talk about in my like introductory class where I use a lot of interactive fiction is some of those basic like literary components like plot. And it's fun kind of showing them different really classical models of plot, and then ones that people have created to try to account for stuff like interactive fiction where there's user choice or this possibility of plots diverging and things like that. I've often had them read stuff like Garden of Forking Paths too, to try to put that kind of stuff into context and show them that tradition as well. But yeah, I thought that was something that would definitely be interesting to get everybody's perspective on. I wanted to, I think, next maybe I'll jump to a question I had for Rachel, because you brought up in your, and this I think connects to John's talk a little bit too. You brought up that it can often be difficult to get students to understand there's a difference between code that's functional, like code that does not produce an error, and code that serves no purpose. Like, it's not producing an error, but it doesn't actually change the story in any way. And John also mentioned that some people really struggle to plan for randomness when they're writing stories. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about like why you thought this in particular was such a sticking point for students. Is it similar to the issue that John brought up in his talk about planning for randomness, or is that like a different thing?
I think there is some similarity there, particularly with the fundamentals course. I think one of the major challenges is there's a lot of fear around code. It's this totally new concept, and I mean, I experienced this as well. Like, it's this kind of magical thing where it's like, I can't do that. That's, people do that and make crazy stuff. So I definitely have sensed that with the students. And so when we're introducing coding concepts, even though the variable text that we use with teaching Inc. is fairly simple, there, I believe, is a tendency to get really, really focused on making that correct. And so making sure that it's written correctly. And then it's easy to forget kind of the big picture of like, why does this exist in the story? So I think that's a common issue in any kind of fundamentals, thinking about even something like art, where as you're learning like drawing techniques or something along those lines, it can be very easy to hone in on the specific details and obsess over those and forget kind of to step back and see the big picture and ask why.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Like, one of the things I think that both of us have talked about to the students when they're working on the planning assignments is thinking about the kind of like intentionality behind what they're going to be creating in the story and like why they're going to create a particular effect or things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, too, there are some cases where I think it's just not planning. If a student doesn't plan for these variations in advance, then the code kind of becomes an extra thing they need to throw in because it's a requirement. So I've seen some where it's like they definitely just put something in written technically correctly, but it doesn't do anything because that's easier than restructuring the story that they had in mind. So something that could help there is just always remembering that the components that we want them to incorporate all need to have a purpose and tie together.
I guess that kind of ties into a question I had for John as well, because you did mention it can be really, really hard to plan for, especially randomness when you're writing an interactive story. And I think Rachel and I would probably agree that students definitely struggle with that too. So I guess, do you have any thoughts about a better way we can teach students to think about randomness and like what that potentially would look like?
So randomness is something that's often embraced in poetry. So I don't know whether all of you have taken courses or not, but there's a number of methods that involve sampling from existing sources and then letting the juxtapositions kind of settle. And a lot of times when a student is looking at a blank page, they get this paralysis about, well, I have to write something to fill that page rather than adapt or sort of assess and pull in. So some ideas might be to just ask them to do free writing, to write the same scene like 3 or 4 different times without looking at previous versions of it, maybe see which the commonalities are and where perhaps variation might be fruitful. You could also use a tool like GPT-2, of which there are a number of online websites that you can put prompts in or put some of your writing and see how it completes it. It's possible that with these tools, you can sample and pull back into your work the best of the ideas and think about it as generation and select rather than having to write each variation directly in its final form in source code.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think sort of circling back to storyboarding or storing out or doing mind maps or something like that, especially what Rachel was saying and connecting directly into what John was saying, is empowering students, right? I think that's something I mentioned in my talk as well. I get really, really excited when they suddenly have this confidence, right? They're building up. They're like, oh, I get it. It's not, something I tell my students is like, programming is not supposed to be hard. I mean, part of that is the legacy, and part of that's just a feeling of the culture around it, but it's not supposed to be. Like, it can be fun and delightful, and something I feel like we all talk about is sort of imbuing that in them, right? Imbuing that confidence and being like, yeah, let's have fun. Let's learn this. Let's figure this out step by step. I think what we're all saying, connecting into that.
Yeah, I've often tried to remind students when working with some of these tools that while it may not always seem like it, when you're especially struggling with a coding problem, that they were made to make it easier. Like they were explicitly designed in many cases to try to do that. So I've often tried to remind them, like, keep in mind, you may be struggling with this particular thing, but there is a way around it in many cases. I think that kind of goes pretty well or leans into a question I had for you as well, Dan. And I think one of the things we focused a lot on in a lot of our talks was choice-based IF, and I think that's natural because we all touched on INC, which does create choice-based IF. But I bring up in my dissertation, and I'd be curious A, to get your opinion on this, and B, if you think this is something we could do in a game. But I bring up in my dissertation the idea that maybe parser IF could be harder for students and players to learn because you have to learn the syntax of the system versus just making a choice in INC is clicking on it, right? So do you think it could potentially be possible to design a parser-based IF game that basically scaffolds the syntax of the system into the game? Like it's teaching you what syntax you should be using as you're playing it?
So Taylor, you were asking me about sort of scaffolded parser games. And I think to start to answer that question, yes, I definitely think it's possible. As to what it would look like, I'm not entirely sure. Something I've been thinking about there are programming languages like Scratch, where they use sort of a drag and drop approach, or other tools like that, where it looks like parser, but you're dealing with the same idea of a language construction, which is sort of what we're getting to in sort of talking about syntax in a couple of different art talks. And so you can start to get closer to that idea. And of course, a well-designed parser game, of course, should have that scaffolded approach. As to if all of them have that, well, of course, games differ depending on authors and depending on their intention. Something else I want to note is sort of that idea of sort of a base literacy. So I think one of the reasons why choice-based games are so popular has to do with sort of a built-in ubiquity of a literacy with clicking on things. So I mean, we've had graphical games like that for a real long time. I'm thinking of everything from starting from Baldur's Gate up into the latest of the Pillars of Eternity series. So this idea that, we click on options, we click on things like the Fallout games, for example, because Taylor and I have both written on those in the past. We have this sort of inbuilt literacy of dealing with choice-based games that doesn't show up as much with parser-based games.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I grew up with, like online MUDs, which really prepare you for things like parser games because they typically have parser systems. And I even found myself when I was teaching game design classes and trying to kind of talk with students about like what the history of games look like and things like that. I found myself really struggling to even get across how different of an experience that is to something like a more modern MMO, like a World of Warcraft or things like that. And so I think that probably does get at what you were kind of mentioning, that there's just this natural literacy with choice systems and hypertext and things that maybe make it a little bit more accessible to people. So, and yeah, I think I also can't necessarily immediately envision what a parser-based game like that would look like either. So yeah, I know that was definitely a tricky question, but yeah, and that's me even speaking with someone who's played a lot of them. I'm still not sure what it would look like. So.
And here's where I get to plug my collaborative book with Aaron Reed and Anastasia Salter on the different styles and design patterns in parser-based and point-and-click adventure games playing the outsider. So check that out once it goes to paperback. Don't buy it now. It's too expensive, or find the library. But speaking of playing the outsider, I have a question for Taylor. How do you recommend students explore things without necessarily fearing the consequences? Now, it's easy to talk about scaffolding when you know where you're going, but what about when you're really exploring identities that you may not yourself have lived in a story format?
Yeah, that can definitely be a tricky challenge with the approach I'm proposing. And I think I would be like, first up front with saying, like, I think mistakes are going to happen, especially when students are exploring things. It's just kind of a natural part of the classroom. It's something that I think Rachel and I have experienced when asking students to write interactive stories in the interactive design class, that students do often sometimes take these great leaps, and sometimes you have to kind of give them a lot of guidance as a instructor to pull them in a different direction. One thing I mentioned a little bit in my talk that I didn't get to, I had to kind of touch on it briefly, is kind of modeling appropriate approaches to these kinds of things by giving them interactive fiction games, or in my case, I might even give them mods that I felt like had been well done. That's something that I do talk about a little bit in my dissertation, is mods of mainstream games that were aimed at querying the game that I felt like did a particularly good job at doing that. So I think that like kind of modeling it for students and giving them appropriate guidance. I do think scaffolding would be really, really important there too, because one of the huge benefits of scaffolding is that ability to try something and fail, particularly on a low stakes assignment, without it being disastrous. So like that's one of the reasons why that's good design in the first place, I guess. So one of the things I definitely do in my dissertation, I think I talked about like one of the assignments in my actual talk is like propose them as a scaffolded like approach. So like they build up on each other.
So I think it's probably time for closing remarks, or maybe any final thoughts. Maybe even something that we all are doing to either cope with the current situation, or maybe we could recommend to others in terms of us as writers and instructors.
Yeah, that's something I was kind of thinking about too, is how can we, especially given the really unique situation we're in, and I think I mentioned in my talk that we really wanted this to be much more of a roundtable and have more audience participation. So I hope many of you are asking questions in Twitch and Discord and things like that. But I think one thing maybe we could think about overall at NarraScope is like some recommendations we would all have for each other about maybe particularly good just pieces of interactive fiction or things that have helped us cope with that kind of stuff. I can't immediately think of one off of the top of my head personally that I've played recently that has helped me with that, but that may be because I've been so involved in dissertation research. But I don't know if anybody has one that they have experienced recently that helped or something like that.
So this one isn't well, it is interactive fiction. I would recommend, if you have a Quest or if you have some other VR headset, check out The Under Presents. It is extended through, I believe, September, where they have live performers interacting and creating improv performances. And it also has a pretty interesting multilinear narrative where you can go to different locations and see the characters interacting on a ship. It's really cool.
One thing that I just wanted to note overall, and I was kind of thinking of it with Taylor addressing students making mistakes and challenges with identity, but I think in general, feedback is really crucial with giving students feedback and calling out specific issues early on so it's easy to correct. And that overall, I think feedback, communication, all of that is relevant, not just to teaching, but as we are kind of all stuck in separate areas. I think something that's really cool with NarraScope is this Discord seems to be very active and a lot of people are communicating. And I feel like this has been a really unique opportunity where we could have been communicating like that all the time, but now that we are more limited, a lot of communication has opened up further, which I think has a really great potential for hopefully continuing those conversations and sharing resources and having discussions. So, communication.
Yeah, I know feedback in particular for me right now at the stage I am in my dissertation work and things like that is particularly helpful. So I extremely and greatly welcome any feedback that anybody has here at NarraScope for the things that I'm doing right now.
So I want to highlight a game, which is my current background, is the Kentucky Route Zero. All 5 chapters are out, which is a fantastic example of a longer game that's in short chunks, which I think is an extremely strong approach. The Telltale approach, like John was mentioning much earlier, of these small things that sort of push you slowly through a story. It's an extremely great game. It has a cat as one of the later characters, and which is what my background is, although you can't quite see the cat character, which I quite enjoy. And I think, echoing Rachel, definitely communication, something I've been really enjoying. We are pre-recording this, but something I've been enjoying as we've been moving up and closer to the time of NarraScope is just communication with people on social media, on Discord, just talking about stuff, talking about resources, talking about different things. Connecting into that and connecting Rachel into what Taylor was just saying. Taylor and I have the unofficial ink cookbook sort of out now. And so I want to encourage people, if you'd like to learn ink, just visit it on GitHub and let us know, submit an issue, or ping us on social media. Or if we also have you have Taylor's email address, but I'm available on most social media, and just let us know what you think. And especially any of that. Like, I think Learning is a very collaborative, learning can be and should be a very collaborative setting to try things, to try new identities, to try new things, to learn new tools, and to be a safe space to do that as you sort of move into, and I think NarraScope especially is a great example of us coming together as a community and setting that tone of let's learn together.
One quick recommendation I want to make if anybody's looking for something to do, there's a podcast that I listen to called Writing Excuses. So if anyone out there is writing, it's not for interactive fiction specifically, it's many novel or short story authors, but the subjects that they talk about are relevant, characters, world building, all of those concepts. But the podcast episodes are very short. They're 15 to 20 minutes. So it's kind of a nice little snippet that you can listen to, and they give you a little bit of homework, and they also recommend different things to read. So it's kind of a nice little short something that can give you opportunity to follow up and dive deeper into different writing concepts.
That definitely sounds like an awesome recommendation. It might be something I need right now myself.
It's fun.
Yeah, I think that's a good place too to kind of to wrap up our discussion. So thank you all for being here virtually today, and thanks everyone for just virtually being here at NarraScope. I'm really excited to see what everybody else has got on going throughout the week and things like that. So yeah, I hope I will see you on Discord and Twitch and things along those lines throughout the week.
Bye.
Thanks.